sort of overall position is like, why do we stand on our differences in that way? Why is it so difficult for us to say who we are without putting it in terms that are hostile to somebody else?
Good evening, everyone. With gratitude, I acknowledge that we gather together tonight on the traditional territory of the Adawandra, Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples on land promised to the people of 6 nations, 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. We are deeply grateful for the hospitality of this land.
Sorry for the delay, everyone. Hello.
My name is Wendy Fletcher. I work at Renison as the president, and it is my privilege to welcome you all here this evening for this celebration of Interfaith Harmony Week and part of our Abrahamic series that runs all year, whereby we find those places where our lives, our stories, our struggles, and our hope meet in the 3 Abrahamic faiths. There's a novelist that I like very well by the name of Aidan Callahan. He's an Irish storyteller. And he writes about stories. He says, stories are the best. Stories entertain, stories edify, stories make us cry, they inspire us, but in the end we tell stories because they save us. And I think there is a lot of deep wisdom in that saying of his. There's something in the narrative that carries something deeply true that connects all of us not only to each other but to the very story of life in our creation itself. And it is in sharing those stories that we can most closely apprehend the places where common ground is possible, where peace is possible, and where knowing not only the other but the self in new ways becomes possible. So it is a great delight for me to have the opportunity to welcome our 3 panelists around the theme of shared story tonight. Ismael, a shared figure in our 3 traditions. We will have the privilege tonight from hearing from 3 wise ones who can share from the location of their tradition as to the meaning of that narrative as light for all of our journey. I'll introduce everybody together now, all 3 speakers. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes or so. And when we are finished hearing the primary narratives from each of the 3 speakers, I'll ask you to have time talking to your neighbors, generating the questions that we then want to bring back up to this place and lay on the table of wisdom for their engagement. So let me begin. These will be the order that our speakers will talk. Our first panelist, Mr. Bob Chodos, who is an active member, lay reader, and bar mitzvah tutor at Temple Shalom, Waterloo Region's Reformed Jewish congregation. Bob participates in interfaith work through Interfaith Grand River and several study groups, as well as the planning committee of the Abrahamic Faiths Forum. His writing on scripture has appeared in Compass, a Jesuit journal, of which he is also the editor, Catholic New Times, and other publications. He has been a guest and well-loved lecturer in courses at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, Wilfrid Laurier's University's Religion and Culture Department, Renison College, and Conrad Grebel College. We welcome you tonight, Bob. Imam Hosam Helel currently serves as the Imam and Religious Affairs Director at Islamic Society of St. Catherine's. He also serves as the Associate Chaplain at Brock University, an instructor at ISNA Canada, and a director of Mishka Social Services. He previously served as the Imam at the Muslim Association of Hamilton and program coordinator at ISNA Canada. He has served as Imam, Khatib, teacher, and instructor for the last 10 years at several universities throughout Canada and the United States. Imam Hosam Helel completed his education in health sciences, Sociology, Neuroscience, and Near and Middle Eastern Civilization at the University of Toronto, and in Quran exegesis at Al-Azhar University. He memorized the Quran at the age of 8 and has since received several jazats
Pronounce it whatever way you like.
in its recitation styles. As the founder and instructor of Quran Journey, he travels across the world with the intention of helping Muslims reconnect deeply with the Quran. Welcome, Imam. Brice Balmer. Brice is assistant professor of spiritual care and psychotherapy at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary. He is an ordained Mennonite minister and is on the steering committee for Interfaith Grand River. He chairs the Abrahamic Faiths Forum. Meeting Our Multi-Faith Neighbors, Herald Press 2006, reflects his involvement in interfaith activities. He's been adjunct professor at a number of seminaries and university colleges, including teaching at the International Institute for Islamic Studies in Qom, Iran. His doctorate in spirituality and addictions is from the University of St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. Welcome, Brice. I'll invite Bob to address us.
I've handed out these sheets with the biblical passages that I'll be primarily referring to. If anybody would like one and doesn't have one, there's still some more up here.
Do they have any?
Can we get Good eyes.
Good idea, yes, they should. Every year on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year that falls in September or early October, one of our Torah readings is Genesis 21, which tells the story of the birth of Isaac and the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. And for the last 20 years or so, it has been my privilege to chant part of that passage from the Torah scroll. Now, there are few better ways of developing an intimate relationship with a Torah passage than preparing to chant it from the scroll, since the scroll has no vowels, punctuation, or cantillation marks. You have to get to know the passage really well if you want to look as if you know what you're doing. And that means practicing it over and over and over again. In the course of all that practicing, you tend to notice a few things. And I'd like to share with you some of the things I've noticed about Genesis 21. But first, the story so far. The story of Ishmael begins in Genesis 16. In the context of the disconnect between God's promise to Abram that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and the fact of his wife Sarai's inability to bear children. Sarai comes up with a stratagem, offering her Egyptian handmaid Hagar to Abram to bear children on her behalf. However, when Hagar quickly gets pregnant, Sarai becomes jealous and mistreats her, and she flees into the wilderness. There an angel appears to her and tells her to return to her mistress. The angel says that Hagar will bear a son, and instructs her to name the son Ishmael, meaning God hears. Furthermore, her descendants will be too numerous to count. Hagar names the place where the angel appeared Be'er Lachai Roi, meaning well of the living one of my seeing. Remember that name. And in due course, she gives birth to Ishmael. 1 chapter and 13 years later, God establishes a covenant with Abram, whose name is changed to Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. The sign of the covenant is circumcision, and Abraham and Ishmael and all the other males of the household are circumcised. God promises that Abraham will be the father of a multitude of peoples, and that his descendants will inhabit the land in which he dwells. There is also another promise, that Sarah, who is now 90 years old, will bear a son, who will be the heir to the covenant. Abraham, who is quite content to see his lineage pass through Ishmael, is skeptical and greets this promise with laughter. The promise is repeated in the next chapter. This time it's Sarah who laughs. Now we come to chapter 21. The promise is fulfilled, and Sarah's son Isaac, Yitzchak, from the root meaning laughter, is born. When Isaac is weaned, Abraham throws a party, and at the party, Sarah sees Ishmael, now a boy of 13, laughing. Once again she becomes jealous and insists that Abraham expel Hagar and Ishmael, so that Ishmael will not pose any threat to the inheritance of her son Isaac. And God intervenes to tell Abraham to listen to everything Sarah says. The only place in these narratives, by the way, where one spouse is commanded to obey another. Abraham reluctantly accedes. Now, at the last Interfaith Grand River meeting, when Brice was letting the group know about this evening's event, he posed the question of why God supports Sarah in her apparently cruel demand. I don't have a definitive answer to that question, but I don't think it has to mean that Sarah's demand is right in the moral sense. Sometimes difficult choices have to be made so that everyone's life can proceed. The passage reminds me of the passage in 1 Samuel, where the prophet Samuel responds to the people's demand for a king with a powerful speech detailing the evils a king will bring. God tells Samuel, in effect, Samuel, you're absolutely right. Give them a king. Things just have to play out the way they have to play out. And play out they do. The next three words after God's speech to Abraham, Vayashkem Abraham baboker, Abraham rose early in the morning, are the same words that inaugurate Abraham's passage à l'acte in the haunting story of the Akedah, the near sacrifice of Isaac in the next chapter. Here in chapter 21, they're enhanced by especially dramatic and ominous cantillation marks. Vayashkem Abraham baboker. Then Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael off into the wilderness with what turn out to be completely inadequate supplies of food and water. Now here we come to one of the most surprising turns in the narrative. And yet it's one that I noticed only after many years of preparing it for chanting. At this point, Hagar and Ishmael on the one hand, and Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac on the other hand, go their separate ways. Their stories become separate stories. The main storyline of the Torah proceeds by way of the Abraham, Sarah, Isaac story. They are the family who will eventually become the people Israel. Their story is our story. So we might expect the text at this point to take leave of Hagar and Ishmael and follow Abraham back to his tent to rejoin Sarah and Isaac. What happens is very different. We hear nothing of Abraham for the rest of this passage. There is no further mention of Sarah until her death 2 chapters later. In the Akedah story, she is the absent presence. Instead, the text lets us share Hagar and Ishmael's distress as their food and water run out. Sitting a bow shot away so she will not see her son die, Hagar weeps. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs comments on the high emotional pitch of this story compared with the absence of emotion in the Akedah. And then another surprising turn. The text says that God hears the cry of the boy. Although the cry comes in Hagar's voice, God hears it as the cry of Ishmael. In fact, Ishmael's name is embedded in that expression. Vayishma Elohim et kol hanar. Ishmael has a special capacity to be heard by God. Perhaps the cry is also for his descendants. the great nation that is often almost nipped in the bud. An angel again appears to Hagar and directs her to a well that provides the life-giving water they need. They make a life for themselves in the wilderness, and the text says explicitly, God is with the boy. This is a poignant, beautifully told story, but it is also something else. It indicates clearly that while Ishmael is not chosen, he is not rejected. He too is favored by God. Last year, I tutored a bar mitzvah student whose Torah portion was Genesis 25, which is on the other side of your sheet. Now, tutoring a bar mitzvah student is another excellent way to develop an intimate relationship with a Torah passage. The student has to learn to do essentially the same thing I do when I chant Torah, except that in this case, we're talking about a 12-year-old who generally has a fairly rudimentary knowledge of Hebrew. So I listen to the student chant the portion, paying close attention so that I can correct mistakes every week for the better part of a year. Here too I get to know the passage pretty well. By the time Genesis 25 begins, Sarah has died and Abraham has purchased a burial crypt for her. Then he provides for Isaac, severely traumatized by the Akedah, by finding him a strong and capable wife, Rebecca. Now at the beginning of chapter 25, Abraham remarries, and we learn little about his new wife Keturah, except that she bears him 6 sons. Abraham sends these sons away with gifts, while his inheritance goes to Isaac. Then Abraham dies at a ripe old age, and Isaac and Ishmael bury him in the crypt that he bought for Sarah. Isaac and Ishmael? Wasn't Ishmael gone? And then we learn that Isaac is living near Be'er Lachai Roi, which, you will remember, is a place associated with Hagar and Ishmael. So it turns out that the two brothers are not as separate as we have been led to believe. We also learn that God blesses Isaac after Abraham's death, and we would now expect the text to proceed to the story of Isaac, Rebekah, and their family, which it does, but only after another excursus into the life of Ishmael. At the end of chapter 21, we were told that Hagar found an Egyptian wife for Ishmael. Now we find out that he has 12 sons, who are named and described as Nisiim, chieftains, princes, heads of tribes. It's the same word that's used today to designate the president of Israel. So the promise that Ishmael will become a great nation is fulfilled. And with that assurance, the text can then go on to report Ishmael's death in terms that echo the report of Abraham's death a few verses earlier. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. This final paragraph about Ishmael reinforces the sense that he is a person of note. He is not rejected. He is favored by God and the father of a great nation, just not our nation. Which leaves open the question, why not? Why is Isaac chosen and not Ishmael? There's an obvious answer to that question. Isaac is the son of Abraham's primary wife, Sarah, while Ishmael is the son of the handmaid, Hagar. Our line is to proceed through Abraham and Sarah, so it has to be Isaac. That's the obvious answer, and it may well be part of the story, but there's a problem with it. In the next generation, Isaac and his primary wife, actually his only wife, Rebekah, have 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. But the covenant passes only through Jacob. Jacob is chosen, while Esau, with the same 2 parents, is not. Although, like Ishmael, he's not rejected. Indeed, Rabbi Sachs suggests that an overarching theme of Genesis is the rejection of rejection. This is what he calls the counter-narrative between the surface narrative of sibling rivalry. Then, in the generation after that, Jacob's wife Rachel pulls the same trick as Sarah. Her situation is somewhat different from Sarah's, in that Jacob also has another wife, Rachel's sister and rival Leah. And while Rachel is childless, Leah gives birth to sons with what to Rachel is distressing ease. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehudah. Rachel needs to get on the board, and so she offers her handmaid Bilhah to Jacob, and Bilhah bears 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah offers Jacob her handmaid Zilpah, who also bears 2 sons, Gad and Asher. Now Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher are counted fully as sons of Jacob, along with Leah's 6 and the 2 that Rachel eventually bears. They receive Jacob's blessing at the end of his life, and their descendants become 4 of the 12 tribes of Israel. So being the son of a primary wife is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for being chosen. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, sons of concubines, are chosen. Esau, son of a primary wife, is not. Is there something else about Ishmael that makes him unsuitable as heir to the covenant? Going back to the very beginning of Ishmael's story, the angel foretells not only his birth, but also his character. He will, the angel says, be a pere Adam, a wild ass of a man, his hand against all, and the hand of all against him. In the face of all his kin he shall dwell. Now the expression al pnei, in the face of, is a bit ambiguous, but is generally interpreted to mean defiance or opposition. We should note that Ishmael actually transcends the character foretold by the angel. As we've seen, his relationship with Isaac, far from being one of opposition, is brotherly in the best sense of the word. Still, Ishmael is presented as a man of the wilderness, an archer, skilled in the arts of survival, strong, resourceful, self-reliant. In the next generation, Esau, also the unchosen one, is presented in similar terms. He is Ish Yodei Atzai, Ish Sadeh, a man who knows hunting, a man of the field. This is a masculine type that is admired in many cultures around the world. Such men often rise to leadership positions. Here is how the current president of the United States is described by one of his courtiers. Trump displays unalloyed masculine strength. His supporters do not care if he's predatory, insulting, or offensive, as long as he's never in doubt, especially if he's kicking the limp Washington establishment around. Trump's instinct-driven behavior confirms that he is the archetypal alpha male, the unfiltered reptilian brain, concerned only with sustenance, survival, or sex. If anything enters his world, they know he must either eat it, kill it, or mate with it. And it goes on from there. Now, I recognize that this comparison is grossly unfair to Ishmael and Esau, neither of whom emerges as an unsympathetic figure in Genesis. But Ishmael and Esau are not us. By contrast, Isaac and Jacob, our ancestors, are what another modern exemplar of the Ishmael-Esau type, former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, once characterized as girly men. Isaac is a successful farmer and keeper of flocks and herds, but at some of the most important turning points of his life, he's shown to accept, willingly or reluctantly, the decisions of others. Abraham's choice of Rebekah as his wife, Rebekah's choice of Jacob over Esau to receive the blessing, even Abraham's decision to sacrifice him on the altar in the Akedah story. And Jacob is described as Ish Tam Yoshev Ohadim, a plain or quiet or simple man, dwelling in tents. It seems clear that the contrast Genesis is presenting is between the settled agriculturalist, who is chosen, and the hunter out in the wilderness, who is not. The rabbis of the Talmudic period took this one step further, imaginatively and anachronistically, turning Isaac and Jacob into their own ideal of masculinity. Torah scholars. When Abraham is described as returning home with his servants after the Akedah, with no mention of Isaac, the rabbis conclude that Abraham sent his son off to study Torah. As for Jacob, the tents in which Jacob is said to dwell are, in the rabbinic imagination, the tents of Shem and Eber, ancestors of Abraham, whom the rabbis conceived as establishing the world's first Torah academy. Rabbi Sachs gives a theological explanation for the choice of the girly men over the alpha males. God chooses those who cannot do naturally what others take for granted. What for others is natural, for Israel is the result of divine intervention. Israel must be weak if it is to be strong, for its strength must come from heaven, so that it can never say, "My power and the strength of my hands have achieved this wealth for me." It is Ishmael's natural strength that disqualifies him. Be that as it may, in this era of Me Too and Time's Up, I think we can be grateful for the more bookish and domestic ideal of masculinity bequeathed to us by our tradition, even if we haven't always lived up to that ideal, as Harvey Weinstein is the latest to demonstrate. At the same time, it's important that we take a cue from our texts, from what Rabbi Sachs calls the counter-narrative, and retain a place in our hearts for those who are not chosen. And if we do that, we might, just might, find that the competing claims of the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael to the same piece of land in the Middle East aren't quite as impossible to resolve as they had previously appeared.
Good evening. Shalom. Salam. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be speaking with you tonight. I ask God to make it easy to be sincere. I ask God to give us steadfastness, to allow us to be among those who speak truth, and to allow us to have a beautiful conversation tonight. Forgive me, I forgot your name.
Wendy.
Wendy started off by saying that stories are incredible. And stories are beautiful. And today, I'm going to present the story of Ishmael, primarily from the Quran, as it's given to us in the text that we believe to be revealed, and in the text that we believe to be, again, the Word of God. Now, in doing so, I'm going to focus primarily on making one main point, and that is the Quranic narrative itself does not go into details about places. It doesn't go into details about lineages, and it doesn't go into details about dates. And the reason for that is because oftentimes when human beings are granted information in excessive amount leads to less practice and more argumentation and debates. And I think the most important part in any story is not to ask what happened and to fight about what happened and where it happened, but to actually ask why and how is this relevant to me, and what are the lessons that I can take from this, and how do I implement this in the modern day and age. And one of the main lessons in the Quran that God actually gives us is that people of the book, now that includes people that are followers of Christ, Christians, that includes people that follow the Jewish teachings, and that includes Muslims. We are people of the book as well. People of the book often end up having very, detailed discussions and debates about things, and get into very detailed academic argumentation and philosophical theorization, but at the end of the day, they're so tired of all of that noise, that there's very little practice and actual faith left. So the direction in these stories direct the Muslim and the human to actually ask, how is this relevant to me living in the modern day and age? So the story of Ismael begins obviously with Abraham. And we believe that Muhammad is not the first Muslim. We believe that Muhammad is not the first Muslim. We believe Islam as a belief system began with Abraham. And Islam as a belief system was practiced by all prophets that are mentioned in the Bible, because Islam as a definition means to submit your will to the will of God. So it means that I can recognize that I'm given such beautiful things by God, the capacity to think, the capacity to engage in intellectual discussions, the capacity to categorize, the capacity to feel, all of those things that make me human. But even then, all of that comes from God. And I'm very small, minuscule, limited in all aspects. So I submit everything that He's given me back to Him. And through that submission, I reach the ultimate form of freedom, which is to move beyond all of those things that could actually, and will actually, force me into submission by submitting back to God. So that is the essence of Islam. God is my primary source, the source of everything that I believe, and through Him, I do everything, and in His name, I engage with the world that He's created. It makes sense. With this hand, I can raise, I can touch, I can hurt, or I can empower, I can pull, I can do many things. So submission means, this is one of the many things that God has given me. How can I use this in a way that serves God, and in a way that actually attains the pleasure and the love of God? That's Islam as a belief. That's Islam as a definition. And so the story of Abraham, or the story of Ismail, begins with, again, as mentioned previously by the rabbi, and it's a humbling opportunity to be speaking on the same panel with you and to be sharing the panel with you. And I don't mean that as, I actually feel that way. I really feel this. So what would you like me to call you?
Just
Lay scholar.
Bob. Biblical scholar. Sure. Awesome. That's humility there. That's a great feature. So the story begins again. Ishmael's story begins with his, Sarah, his primary wife, as was mentioned earlier, and him actually praying to God. I've reached a point in my life where I'm aging, and I am now coming to a point where I need someone to carry my legacy forward. And God has a way of answering prayers, and in His way of answering prayers, He teaches very valuable lessons. That things will happen when God wills, not when you will. And there's a reason for that. And in that delay or in that deferring of the actual prayer coming true is a lesson to be patient. To be patient, to recognize that God gives when it's perfect. And so eventually he marries Hajar, as mentioned earlier. And when he marries Hajar, they're gifted with a son. And when the son is gifted, God commands Abraham. So that's where, again, we would differ from the narrative. God commands Abraham to actually make a migration and to travel to a place that is barren, that is empty, a place that is wild, like you mentioned. And that is one of the definitions and the ways we understand that term that was mentioned earlier. A very wild place. And he's commanded to leave his son and his wife there. Now that's a very difficult thing to do. But again, the essence of the message of Abraham is submission from an Islamic point of view. And the way that we look at it is that in order to actually grow in faith, in order to grow in general, growth emerges out of sacrifice and out of struggle. Even now when you're trying to build your muscles, you got to tear your muscles. You got to push yourself to the limits in order for growth to emerge. And a whole city would be born out of this. And a whole city that will become center to an entire faith, an entire people, an entire legacy would be born out of this command by God to take Ismail, and his wife, Abraham taking his wife and his son, and leaving them in the desert. Now one of the most beautiful prayers that Ishmael makes, or Ibrahim makes in the Quran, as he's leaving just leaves his family, and he starts walking because he doesn't know what to say. What is he going to say to his family? So his wife asks him, is this something that God has commanded you? And he responds saying, yes. And she says, if this is a command from God, then I have no worries, no fears, no insecurities. I'm completely accepting of it. Because a man can provide, but a man is limited. A husband can provide, but a husband is limited. A wife can love, but the love and the provision and the caring and the guidance of the human is nothing compared to the divine. And that is the lesson that we're being taught here, is that even family, your worry for your family, your love for your family is a beautiful thing, but it comes from God, and it must be done through God. And if it's not done through God, it becomes actually another minor God. If your love for your family becomes so overwhelming that it distracts you from your love for God, then you're not truly believing in God. And there are so many ways that we take God. It's not just, by directing and worshiping and bowing. It's also by holding a very exceptional place and having complete trust and dependence on something so much that we think, I can't live without it. So the lesson that we're taught here, and someone that is sent here, Abraham and his son Ismael, they're chosen, and Hajar are chosen to allow for this message to resonate throughout humanity. And the question is, why them? Because their faith in God was so much higher. You don't place a 500-pound weight on someone who's just beginning to work out because they can't handle it. So the fact that God chooses Abraham and Ishmael and Hajar for this is not supposed to be why. It's actually supposed to be, that's an amazing thing. That God would choose such people for such a great sacrifice, for such a great, again, manifestation of submission and manifestation of, again, selflessness. And so the message here is that humans are great, but only through God. And we must love one another, but through God. And that love comes from where? The capacity to look at another being and to engulf and to respect and to show compassion. Where does it come from? It comes from God. So we have to remember that, again, the source of all must be the one we direct everything all back to. Right? That's one of the messages here. And so Hajar now, she's left in the middle of the desert, in this wild place, and she has this baby who was just born in her hands. And now she could just sit down there and she could say, you know what? God has done this to me. God has to take care of me. I'm just going to accept my fate. But she doesn't do that. And in the Islamic tradition, what she does is she takes her baby and she has her baby in her arms and she paces back and forth across the two giant mountains of Safa and Marwa in the Arab Peninsula, and she's looking, calling out, even though there's no one around. And now she places her baby in the middle of the mountains and she paces back and forth a total of 7 times, calling on the top of each mountain, even though no one is around. But she knows that submission is not just based on waiting, sitting passively and waiting for God to intervene. It's based on doing everything that is within your limited capacity to actually exhaust all options. And once options are exhausted, God's intervention, love, and capacity is manifested. And that is one of the valuable lessons that we learn from this. So by going back and forth, eventually what happens is after she's exhausted, she's given up, she looks down, she's feeling a little bit helpless at this time, she looks down on the ground, and boom, her son is pecking, as the narrations would tell us, on the ground, and the well of Zamzam is born. The well of Zamzam is born, and that would become actually the entire, again, the reason for an entire city to be born. Because where do people usually like to live? Traditionally, historically, around water. And so through the struggles and the sacrifice and the submission of a woman, an entire city is born. And that is a very valuable lesson that we are again taking from this beautiful story, is that the sacrifice of our counterparts, the sacrifice of our fellow sisters in humanity, our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, that is a great sacrifice, and God has given our counterparts, our female counterparts, a great capacity to love, a great capacity to endure, and a great capacity to give. And that is a great gift that we should not forget. An entire city is born out of this. Now what happens when the water comes and the birds come, as the narrations would tell us? Eventually the travelers that are traveling through this wild place find that there's again a remnant of these birds traveling. So they come and they think, what's happening? And they look around and they see this. And they ask Hajar for permission, finding out again from her the way she carries herself. She's a woman of modesty and respect. They ask if they can also spend some time there and spend, imagine the caravan is passing, so they want to spend some time there and basically take from the well. And eventually that would lead to an entire establishment in the city of Mecca. The next part of the story has Abraham coming back and forth, visiting his family. And when he comes visiting the family, he's seeing his son grow up, and he's happy. And his son is now beginning to speak the Arabic language, which is the language that the Yemen at the time spoke, and the peninsula at the time spoke, even though he is the son of Abraham, who is a Hebrew. And here you see the mergence, or the merging of two beautiful languages, two beautiful peoples, two beautiful civilizations coming together in this city. And that is again a very valuable lesson, and that is the unification, migrating for the sake of God. Now I want you to imagine this. Just imagine what it means for those of us who believe in Islam as God's message, and believing in Mecca as a city that is holy. That city, from the beginning, is born based on submission. People did not come together in that place seeking economy. People did not come together in that place seeking money, seeking physical materialism. The story of the birth of that place is a story based on sacrifice. The water wasn't already there. The water was born out of the sacrifice, the submission, and the struggle of a woman. Now, the narration in the Quran would fast forward to another very important piece in Abraham and Ishmael's life. When Abraham visits and he sees his son has grown to be as the Quran mentions, to be committing sa'i. And sa'i means he's now hustling. He's in the age where he can travel and work, and now he can actually fend and take care of himself. And God allows him to see in a dream or a vision. We as humans have dreams, prophets have visions. He sees that he is sacrificing, slaughtering his son. And so we believe that the story of the sacrifice is actually the story of Ismail, the story of Ishmael. And now, when God commands him to do this, he goes and he tells his son, this is what I've seen. What do you think? A father consulting his fellow son. What do you think? And his son says, believing fully in the prophetic tradition and believing that his father is a prophet, if'al ma tu'mar, do as you will, satajiduni insha'Allah min as-sabirin, do as you're commanded by God, you will find me to be truly patient, submitting to his will. And so here the story of Abraham, Ishmael, Hajar is a story of sacrifice and submission. Hajar submits her will to the will of God by accepting that she has to be there. Ismail submits his will to the will of God by accepting that he is to be sacrificed. And he goes with it. And he goes ahead and he reaches the point where the sacrifice is supposed to happen. And he turns to his father and he says, you know what? I don't think you'll be able to actually go through this if you're able to look at me in the eye. So I recommend that you turn me over so that you have my neck facing you, so that my emotions or my expressions don't stop you from committing and fulfilling the command of God. Again, sacrifice and submission, that is the key. And now, of course, the entire mission and the plan that is said by God is not there for him to actually sacrifice his son. It is there to teach and to show what level of submission Abraham has reached to. And when he's about to actually go for it and he's completely submitted and accepted the faith, and of course the narration shows that Satan tries to, distract him. Come on, this is your son. I'm sure God would understand. He ignores all of that noise and he's about to do it. And then the alternative sacrifice, an animal, is presented. Again, the lesson there is that you have to submit your will to the will of God. And finally, the next chapter of Ismail's story is a chapter based on construction. A while passes, Ismail is now grown, and his father Abraham sees in another vision that he is building a house, raising the foundation or the pillars, and that house is the black cube, the Kaaba, which would become symbolic of the oneness of God, a place where everyone can come to, not pray towards, but pray at, a symbol for humanity to unite, put aside all of their differences. A place that is born based out of submission is now a place where people come back to remember that legacy and to remember that sacrifice. So they build together the Kaaba, and we believe that from that lineage comes the Prophet Muhammad. And so the Islamic stance on this is that all of the children of Abraham he makes a prayer for them. And he says, God, I have, and I want you to listen to this prayer. I'm going to recite it in Arabic. Because when we come together, the stuff that I hear from you, the stuff that you hear from me, we can read it in a textbook. But what makes this unique is that we're able to listen to one another chant and get a feel of what it actually sounds like. And that's what makes this experience hopefully a beautiful one. So I'll recite to you the verse, the ayah, the sign, the portion of the Quran, and then I'll translate. Abraham says, رَبَّنَا إِنِّي أَسْكَنْتُ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي بِوَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ عِنْدَ بَيْتِكَ الْمُحَرَّمِ رَبَّنَا لِيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ فَاجْعَلْ أَفْئِدَةً مِنَ النَّاسِ تَهْوِي إِلَيْهِمْ وَارْزُقْهُمْ مِنَ الثَّمَرَاتِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَشْكُرُونَ رَبَّنَا إِنَّكَ تَعْلَمُ مَا نُخْفِي وَمَا نُعْلِنُ وَمَا يَخْفَى عَلَى اللَّهِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا فِي السَّمَاءِ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ الَّذِي وَهَبَ لِي عَلَى الْكِبَرِ إِسْمَاعِيلَ وَإِسْحَاقَ إِنَّ رَبِّي لَسَمِيعُ الدُّعَاءِ رَبِّ اجْعَلْنِي مُقِيمَ الصَّلَاةِ وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي رَبَّنَا وَتَقَبَّلْ دُعَاءِ رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيَّ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَوْمَ يَقُومُ الْحِسَابِ. And again, I really love this prayer that Abraham makes. And what he makes is, he says, when he's leaving his family behind, he's going back a little bit, he says, oh God, my Lord, I have left my family in a place that is wild, a place that is abandoned, a place with no vegetation. And now he's asking God for help. What do you think he's going to ask God for? He's going to say, you know what, I want some water for them. I want some food for them. Take care of them. He doesn't say that. The first thing he says to God, allow for them always to be praying and connected to you. And this is so beautiful, because you can give a man to fish, or you can teach him how to fish. So by making prayer, by praying to God that his progeny, his family is always connected to God, that is more important than praying for anything else, because anything else is temporary and can go. But for praying for his family to be connected to the divine, that is the source of everything. That is the ultimate prayer. So again, it shows you the focus and the priority. So first he says, allow my family to always be connected to you, and then grant them from the provisions, the worldly provisions, and allow the hearts of people to be inclined and attached to them. Right? So first, allow them to be connected to you, allow the hearts of people to be connected to them, and then give them from the provisions so that they may be grateful. That is the ultimate focus, the ultimate teaching of Islam in a nutshell. Money, family, happiness, physical stuff, all of that fluctuates. But the source of all of it is God. So remember to connect to Him sincerely, and through Him, everything else comes. And that is again the essence of Islam, submission. I do want to say thank you for giving me again this opportunity. That in a nutshell is the story of Islam. And to recap again, the details of the story are all linked to the lessons that we can gather, not to the details that we can argue about. Have a blessed day, and I look forward to the discussions that we have from this.
I wanted to go last because I, as a Christian, had read the story of Ismael in Genesis, but found out as I was working on let me just say what happened. At the House of Friendship where I was working, the Muslim community was celebrating the Eid al-Adha. Did I say it right? And realized that this was about the story of Ismael. And as I read in the background the story of Ishmael, I thought, well, wait a second. That's like our story. That's not like our story. Have I read the story in Genesis? Have I not read all the story in Genesis? And so I had to go back into Genesis and read all of the details about Ishmael in one form or another, which was very fascinating to me. And I realized as Bob and the Imam were talking that I'm even starting to get these two stories mixed up a little bit as I'm doing this. Because the Eid is where people give food, halal food, to the House of Friendship. And we use that food because it's halal for all of the Muslims who come, even though the food is not designated that it has to go a certain way. But we want to use it that because we don't have enough of that otherwise. So I see that there's two stories, and they come together, and there's one story, and so I just tried to think it through, and I've also used some text. So I'm going to go over the story again a little bit. First of all, Hagar comes to Abram and Sarai and the household in Egypt after Abram has passed off Sarai as his sister, not as his wife. And when Sarai goes to the house of Pharaoh, all kinds of chaos starts to break out. And so the Pharaoh comes back and says, who is this woman and why is there all this chaos? And finds out that the chaos is because Abram lied about who Sarai was. And so as a result of that, Hagar becomes a part of that family. Now, then we get into the story that Bob was telling about Sarai not being able to have a baby and yet being promised. And so a really important part of the story at this point is that Sarai cannot believe that God is really going to act. So there's a whole sense of disbelief. And so in the midst of her disbelief, she says to Abram, go ahead, you and Hagar, my servant, now can have a baby, and this will be what God wants for us. But then, after Hagar becomes pregnant, Sarai becomes very, very jealous. And so Sarai runs away. She's actually, since in the biblical narrative, when it talks about her, there's all kinds of ideas about what does it mean for her to be of the house of Pharaoh. So she's a pretty feisty lady. This is not some, she has a certain sense of dignity about her. And so she runs off into the desert, gets away from Abram and Sarai, and she's met by an angel. And she talks to the angel, and in a sense, she, in some ways, is talking to God, which is also a really important part of Hagar, or Hajar, becoming a prophet, a prophetess, because she actually is a person who has talked with God twice. So, God, the angel Gabriel, says you're going to have a baby. He's going to be a powerful man. And you're going to have children and grandchildren through your baby. And it's going to be a whole people, and this is a divine promise. Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, says that this is a very separate pericope, or a little separate section. It goes with the all, but Sarai and Abram are not really right there. So Ishmael is supposed to be, as Bob said, a wild Asama man. But then, as I was reading in other contexts, from the people who know Hebrew, and I want to tell you I don't know Hebrew, I have to rely on the interpreters, that this could also mean that Ishmael was going to be a free man. He was not going to be a slave. A son of a slave ends up being a slave. And in this case, there's a real sense that Ishmael was not going to be a slave, and that he also could be cooperative with others. So I'll let Bob, in fact, I passed the book over to him to really try to think through some of these other interpretations of Hebrew, which I can't go. But we have kept this fiercely independent sense of who Ishmael is and who he can be, and maybe there are other ways of looking at who Ishmael is. Hagar is a slave, she is submissive, but she talks with God, and she even talks about names God, El Roi. She is one of the very few to name God and to communicate. Martin Luther, it was interesting, is one who honors Hagar. I found that kind of interesting because Martin Luther often had a lot of negative things to say about Islam, and yet he really was he thought of Hagar as being a family woman and having loyalty. So it's interesting, and taking family seriously, and that she does submit to God. So a baby boy is born, and Abram names him Ishmael. And then all four people, Abram, Sarai, Hagar, and Ishmael, seem to be content for a long period of time. Everything seems to be going along very, very well with them. But in the meantime, the story seems to say God is not content like the rest of them are, and God wants to move ahead and restore an earlier promise. But before that happens, there is this special time when God is with the people of Israel, and they establish the covenant where God says, I will be your people. And the men are circumcised, and Ishmael is one of the people who's circumcised, and Ishmael is a part of this really important covenant where God says, I will be your people. At this point, Abram becomes Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah. And according to Abraham, according to what happens, Ishmael, again, would have been somewhere around a teenager or an older boy. And he's a part of this promise, this really important promise. So we have to look at two promises, which is what Bob was looking at. So what is clear and very significant as I was reading this, that I hadn't spent as much time, is that Abraham is a really, really good father. He and his son love and respect each other. He argues on behalf of his son with God. He argues on behalf of his son with Sarah. He is constantly standing up for Ishmael the whole way through. He doesn't really see why he needs a different son to inherit his status, his property. And he sees Ishmael as a child of the promise. So Abraham is no longer waiting for a son. He has Ishmael. Abraham also has promised God, or Abraham has also heard the promise that Ishmael will be a people and grow into a people. And Hagar has also heard that promise. So then Sarah and Abraham are again visited, and they find out there's another child to be born. And when Sarah conceives and has a son, and the son is a little older, as Bob was saying, Sarah becomes very jealous, has some comments about Ishmael, and says, exile these people. Abraham then argues that he shouldn't have to do this. And God says, Isaac will have the birthright, so it's all right if you let Ishmael go. But he doesn't want to see them leave. And then God says to Abraham, obey Sarah. So what kind of a God abandons a youth and his mother and goes against the love of a father? Is a very interesting question as I was struggling with this. What's happening here? And I don't understand it yet. I may never. Abraham obeys. He gets up early in the morning, which is a sign of righteousness and submission, and takes the youth and the mother into the desert, leaving them with provisions. And Hagar wants to know whether this is God's decision, and this is where I get mixed up, because I think this is part of the Quran or the Islamic story rather than a part of the Christian story, where Hagar says, okay, is this decision God's or is this decision yours? I think it makes an interesting part of the story, though. I want to make sure it's in there. And when Abraham says this was God's decision, not my decision, then Hagar says, well, okay, I'll submit. But I actually think that's the Quranic story. It's not in the, but I thought it was so wonderful, I wanted to put it in. So we all have our own mythologies. She submits and Abraham leaves. So Sarah has now established an inheritance for her son Isaac, not the firstborn and not the son of a slave. A friend of mine says, in the Bible we have all kinds of dysfunctional families. This raises a lot of questions for me about how God works through dysfunctional families. Maybe I got too much into psychotherapy and spiritual care or something. But it really is, and Bob's illustration of that is very clear. We have a lot of dysfunctional stuff going on, and yet somehow God is triumphant over the dysfunctional stuff that's going on in the Bible. And so what does it say about a God who loves people, a God who goes beyond our foibles, a God who works beyond our own understandings? Jewish rabbis in the Mishnah support the tradition, not in scriptures, that Abraham loved Ishmael and traveled to see his son and to see Hagar regularly. Some rabbinic interpretations say that Abraham even found a wife for Ishmael, although there's several things. Hagar does it, and Ishmael and Abraham does it. Finds a wife. Then, when Sarah dies, shortly after the story in the Hebrew scriptures about Isaac being sacrificed but not being sacrificed, Sarah dies right away after that happens. And then the question is, who is this Keturah? Is Keturah Hagar returned? And does Hagar come back and be a part of Abraham's tent? So then we get to Genesis 25, which I had never read. It never shows up in our lectionary. It's nowhere in our Christian understanding. So we actually let Ishmael out of the text as Christians once we get past leaving them in the desert. Then it's over. Some of you younger guys who are going to be preaching, you need to remember that there's Genesis 25. Younger men and women. So Isaac and Ishmael come back together to bury Abraham in a cave where Sarah is buried. There is nothing in the text to indicate any animosity or discord between Isaac and Ishmael. There is now a real distinction between Abraham's son, one born after with Sarah, two sons, a son of the promise and a son of another promise, Isaac and Ishmael and Isaac. So at the end, Isaac inherits everything. Ishmael inherits the promise that he's received, and there seem to be no issues at the burial scene. But here are the two of them, and for me, I start to ask the same questions that Bob is asking. How much have we made of two different promises? How much of these stories, if we told them a little bit differently, might help to break some of the questions that there are about Arabs and Jews and what kind of promise and what kind is going on? Can Arabs and Jews, can Christians and Muslims and Jews all live together? There are promises to all of them. Eric Cohen, who was in the interpretation text, was God with Ishmael as God was with Isaac. Perhaps God's love is not binary, not supremacist. Is this a difference that we need to begin to talk about? Abraham is an interesting character portrayed in these passages. He obviously loves his son Ishmael. He does not want to exile the mother or the son, and yet God sides with Sarah. But as we read through the story, and as we read the Muslim and Hebrew Christian traditions, or Jewish Christian traditions, we have a lot to think about in this story. And we have a lot to think about of how much have we made these two stories and these two men so different, and rather than saying, well, there's two promises, there's two histories, maybe we need to honor both histories and move ahead. There were a couple other things I wanted to say about it, and I just realized I put the wrong notes. Anyway, but I think it's very interesting for me, and I would encourage other people to begin to read all the stories, to begin to read the stories out of the Quran and listen to them, to read the stories out of the Hebrew scriptures and listen to them, and to begin to find out how we've expanded on these traditions and some of our mythologies based on this binary and supremacist nature rather than based on a way in which we maybe could come together as many people from many cultures. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, all three. Each one of you has left us with a very rich motif. What I'd like to do now is send those motifs and that richness to you. If you can form yourself in small groups for a few moments, reflect together about what you've heard, and perhaps generate a question or two or comment that you would like to bring forward from your group to the speaker. So about 10 minutes or so we'll spend. Okay, I'll just stand to the side, but I'll call you. If you want to put your hands up, I'll keep track. You guys all ready? Okay, who wants to jump in first? Please.
I'll throw in a question that
Good.
I'll take responsibility. No one else in the group wanted to take responsibility for. Bob, with your dichotomy of girly men and wild asses, what do you make of the modern day Sabra?
Just to define some.
Which is a native-born Israeli who, as a group, the stereotype is that consciously rejected some of the girly man ethos.
Yeah, and even more than that, I mean, you know, Jonathan Sachs's statement that Israel has to be weak so that Israel has to be weak to be strong. I mean, obviously the state of Israel has not adopted that philosophy. I mean, I guess, and I've been thinking about this. I mean, you know, when I sort of saw that quote, but I guess what I would say is that, you know, Zionism and the state of Israel, on the one hand, sort of like tap into some very deep religious and cultural currents in the Jewish tradition, but they also go against other currents, and you know, where does that ultimately lead? I don't know. I mean, like, you know, in terms of, I mean, you know, there are sort of groups in Israel that, you know, there are sort of segments of Israeli society that sort of would fit that pattern. I mean, you know, the ultra-Orthodox who sort of don't serve fully in the army because Torah study is considered more significant, or the, you know, but I mean, it's a good question, and there is a contradiction there. I guess that's what I would say.
Others?
So I have a very quick question. Are Sarah and Isaac mentioned in the Quran at all?
One of the things that, that's a good question. The number of Banu Israel, children of Israel, prophets and messengers that come from the other side, Ishaq's side, there is actually more mention of them than Muhammad by name in the Quran. So we actually get there's a whole chapter called the chapter of Joseph, you know, who was one of the children, of grandchildren of Ibrahim through Ishaq. So the whole chapter, the whole story is there. And there's a section of the Quran where God is speaking to, you know, to the entire Quran has a third of it that is directly speaking, as I was mentioning to my friends here, directly addressing Banu Israel, children of Israel. And so, yes, the biblical stories are mentioned in detail in the Quran.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So the real question, I mean, that was either yes or no.
Yeah.
But the question is for everybody there. I understood you just say very clearly that Islam is submission. That they're the same word. The focus of Islam is to submit to God because God is God. And as a Christian, most of the time we use the word obey rather than submit. It just doesn't come easily to my tongue to say, I will submit to God, but rather, I will obey God. So I'd like to know from you how close they are. From Brice, do I have that mostly right? And from Bob, are either of those words make sense in Judaism?
They do, but also, I mean, the word Yisrael means struggle with God, right? So I mean, you know, there certainly is a sense that we need to submit to God's will. I mean, that's certainly not foreign to a Jewish sensibility, but at the same time, I mean, we struggle with God. Well, first of all, we struggle to discern, like, what is God's will. I mean, you know, but also, I mean, we, you know, I mean, Abraham, for example, does not always, I mean, you know, in the case of the, when he finds out that God is planning to destroy Sodom, he, you know, he certainly, I mean, that is God's will, and yet he says, you know, is this really your will? Is this just? So there's also that sense of one's relationship with God being a struggle.
When I was teaching the theodicy course, which is around what do we do with God when there's evil in the world, and so part of that is to lament. And in both Christian and Hebrew scriptures, we have major sections around lament in the Lamentations and in the Psalms, and even Jesus on the cross laments from a psalm that, why does this have to happen to me, etc., etc. And at that point, well, a third of the class was Muslim, which was interesting, and 2 of them were Shia scholars from Qum. And they said, Brice, we need to teach a class because Muslims don't lament, we submit. And so I tried to think about, you know, when is it that I lament? You know, when is it that I have the arguments that Bob's talking about, like Abraham? Well, I'm not as good as Abraham, but I mean, just, you know, like in that sense of I don't understand and I want to know more, and I want to, before I just sort of submit, I want to have some questions and wrestle this through. And when is it that I can just submit? And so since I had my 2 clergy friends there in my class, I've tried to figure out, can I just submit? But there's sometimes I just have to lament. I just can't. It can't.
One of the, you know, one of the difficulties in translating into English is, again, every word is loaded with a multitude of meaning, and you have to. I mean, it's not just submission, because submission has this sense of kind of like blind. I'm just going to accept it, move on. But the word itself in Arabic, you know, the word Islam, has a multitude of meanings. Number one, it means completion. It means something is whole, something that was sick and now is beautiful and is good. So that's one. And another one is peace. You know, when I greet my fellow, I say salam, which means peace, right? And the other one is submission, that is based on rationally understanding the position of God. Once I understand the position of God rationally, it follows that any command that comes from this being who is all powerful, all capable, the uncaused cause, the source of all, it follows that everything that he commands will, even if it seems temporarily, you know, inconvenient for me, eventually it will make sense. And so the one thing that I do want to just make a distinction about is that in Islam we can pray, and we do pray, and we do, you know, communicate with God. That is something we do 5 times a day. So if it was just based on submission, well, why are we praying if we just accept our situation? And we're allowed to ask questions. As a matter of fact, God in the Quran continuously asks, don't you think, don't you reflect? So it's not just pure submission, okay, I'm just going to blindly accept. No, it's meaning I accept, and when I ask, I'm not asking to challenge your authority. I'm asking, recognizing my limitation and hoping to be enlightened. And I hope that kind of makes sense. And I just want to go back to one of the things that you mentioned, just briefly, very briefly. I don't want to. I mean, in talking about, you know, Ishaq and Yaqub and all of these things, Islam as a religion is often portrayed to be very anti-Semitic by many people, and anti-Jewish or anti-Israel. And I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's intellectually honest. And I was just speaking with my friends here, and I was giving them the example, just a small section of the Quran. There's a beautiful story, and this is a traditional story accepted by everyone, whether Orthodox or everyone who claims to be Muslim and believes in the Quran has to submit to the reality of the story. And the story is in Surah An-Nisa, the chapter of women, and it talks about a Jewish man who was accused of stealing in Medina. And again, the sentiment in Medina was not very good for Jewish people at the time. And this Jewish man was accused of theft by a fellow Muslim. And it was actually a Muslim who stole the shield. And I can't get into the details of the story, but the Quran came to defend the Jewish person, and the entire section of that Quran, or the stories come to, or the verses come to actually say, and do not let your sentiments or emotions blind you from committing and giving justice. Do not let your, whatever it may be, your emotions towards someone be the reason that you give that person something that they don't deserve. Or your emotions against someone be the reason that you take something from that person that is rightfully theirs, right? And I think if you look at Islamic history as a whole, I'm not talking about the last 100, 200 years, is a very small section of history. You can look at Islamic history, Jewish history, Christian history, and look at areas where it's very similar to what's happening in the modern world with Islam. If you look at Christianity, Judaism, Islam as histories and areas where they overlap, I think for the largest part of history, Muslims, Christians, Jewish people coexisted. They had beautiful times, they had beautiful relationships. We have Muslim buildings that were co-built by Jewish architects. We have Christian authors who translated many of the Greek texts into Arabic, and then that becomes a whole basis for a philosophy and studies. It's incredible. We have Muslims who funded Christian projects and Christian literature. And so again, do not take history out of context, and don't let this modern socio-political issue that is Israel and Palestine, and we all have very strong, sometimes opposing views on it. Let's not forget that often it's not about religious pretext, it's about socio-political environment. And that's where the issue is. I believe that if Moses, Isa, Jesus, and Muhammad were coexisting today, they would all be leading us towards loving one another, being critical of one another, and encouraging each other to be committed truly to God, not selfish interests or things that get in the way of true submission, going back to how we defined it earlier.
Also, one other thing about that, I think for Jews, like the idea of obedience to God primarily takes the form of obeying God's commandments. It doesn't necessarily mean accepting one's situation passively.
And in lament, at the end of lament, you submit. But you have to have a little bit of a tassel first.
A couple more questions. Dan's waiting.
I did want to say something about Israel meaning struggle. When you think of Jacob struggling with the angel,
Yeah.
actually with God, and he says, I won't leave you until you bless me.
Yeah.
That is a very important part.
That's
then
actually where the
of
name
the
Israel
Jewish,
comes from.
of the Jewish
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
And then I would like to say something here. Obedience and submission to God first, Allah at one. Isn't that the same or something very similar?
Obedience and submission?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe, yeah.
It is. It is basically almost the same.
Yeah.
Because Jesus in Gethsemane, he submitted. He prayed, and then he submitted.
Absolutely.
Right?
And that's why we believe.
He obeyed and submitted. And I do have that question for the rabbi coming from the Jewish Christian background. We know that obedience and submission is the first one, and then Christ and the sacrifice is the one that follows. How would that fit into the Jewish, what should I say, religion or how could we connect that? Because Christ is obedience and submission to God his Father, and then sacrifice for us. How could we connect that with both Jewish and Islamic religions?
Yeah, well, I think
You don't understand what I mean?
No, we do.
You'll have to think about it, yeah.
Well, I think that, in terms of, so basically, like where do the ideas of obedience and submission and
Christ.
sacrifice?
Obedience and submission to his Father
Right,
for dying, sacrifice,
Yeah.
dying for us.
yeah. I mean,
Making the
that's,
sacrifice for us, for the world,
Yeah.
right?
yeah, I mean, that's not our story, right? I mean,
No,
that's-
I know, I know. I'm
But-
just wondering how you would look at it and what would be your thoughts on that when you look at the Christian, at the Christian religion. We have not been talking about sacrifice towards, God, that comes out of obedience to God, that the sacrifice for others comes out of it in the Christian religion.
Can I try?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah. First, the height of our prayer as Muslims is when our forehead touches the ground in prostration, and we recognize that God is far infinitely greater.
Mhm.
Now, to answer your question, very simply, there's actually a verse in the Quran where God instructs Muhammad, telling Muhammad, and tell them, if the most merciful God had a son, I would be the first to worship him. So that is essentially the claim of Islam. That if whatever God says, we have no issues submitting to. If God tells me he has 3 children, 4, whatever that means, in that sense, I'm willing to submit as a Muslim. But the entirety of the Islamic message itself sees itself as a fulfillment, a continuation of the previous prophecies, and a continuation of the previous revelations. So Islam actually sees itself, in many cases, as coming to, and again, I'm saying this with respect, but just, with academic, just again, respect. It is not meant to hurt. It is not meant to cause emotion or pain. I don't mean that at all. I'm just stating a fact that is, a religious one. Islam sees itself as coming to allow the true believers of Christ to come back to the true submission and belief in Christ and who Christ was, and the true believers in God following Moses to actually follow what Moses actually taught. So there's a claim in the Muslim tradition that there are some insertions, intentional, non-intentional misinterpretations that have accumulated over time in previous scriptures, and Islam kind of comes to tell people of the book to go back to what the book actually says. So regarding Jesus, I accept him as a prophet. I accept him as a messenger. I accept him as born, through the virgin birth. We have a whole chapter committed to Miriam. We have an entire, Jesus is actually mentioned much more in the Quran than Muhammad. But when it comes to the sacrifice, which makes a huge portion of Christianity, it doesn't exist in the Quran. It's actually the exact opposite. God is one alone, and any way that you try to interpret the Trinity would contradict that oneness of God. But even then, even having expressed that, the same book that says that instructs me to love you, to treat you justly, to interact with you, and to invest in you, and to work together in areas where we have commonalities and common ground.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have time for one more. There's a hand just at the back.
Due to my lack of English proficiency, when you asked that question about obedience and submission, I googled just because. So what's the difference between submission and obedience? And the very first link that came up, it was interesting. I didn't know actually the difference. So it says submission. I just want to read it. I thought you might be interested. Submission requires love, respect, and willingness to yield to another. Obedience, on the other hand, doesn't require any personal relationship between the one giving the command and the one obeying the command.
Very interesting. Thank you for looking that up.
I don't know.
Once more, English reveals its slipperiness.
Well, that was pretty quick, so if we have one more, we have time. One more? Any more? One more question or speaker? One more. Okay,
It's maybe not a fair one, it's maybe a question for all of us to take away with us, but what we were discussing here was that I think what Bob and Brice both drew a lot of attention to was this misconception that I grew up in a Judeo-Christian upbringing, that kind of Ismael, went off into the desert with Hagar and that was the end of it. But you both brought back this, reawakened us scripturally to the idea that they did remain brothers. They buried their father together. There was that promise that you drew attention to. There were two promises. So that is in there scripturally. And I know that, brother, when you spoke as well, one of the things that might have been enlightening is in the Quran when it references these past prophets, that it mentions Ishmael and Isaac multiple times together, synonymously, as being part of this history. Although you didn't mention that, it's there within the Quran. So here we have these three scriptural references consistently telling us that we are together. We are coming from the same source. We have these promises. So what's the missing link, in your opinions or in our opinions as a community, when we discuss these things and we can see this historic similarity that we're all coming from? What's the missing link in our world? Why is it that many practitioners of all three of these traditions are missing that vital thing? And if we have an answer for that in your opinions, maybe that can lead us to what we can do in our own respective communities to get back to an understanding of what our scriptures are telling us. What could be some recommendations for us to help? Because as a Muslim, sometimes I go into Muslim schools, and I'll get the children to sing Shalom, and I'll see some people, I'm going to sing in Hebrew, forget it. And it's only because of the defiance. It's not, there's no love in that defiance. And sometimes when I sing in choirs and I want the children to sing Salam, and there'll be Christian children who are, well, why should we be singing in Arabic? That's not like, we've got some link we're missing. What's your opinion and what's your suggestion for us to help?
Well, I mean, we live in Canada where there are two official languages, and you'll find the same kind of it hasn't reached the point of sort of widespread violence, but you'll often see the same kind of, I'm not going to sing in French, I hate that language. I mean, much papa, no pal. So, I mean, I guess the question, so the sort of overall question is like, why do we stand on our differences in that way? Why is it so difficult for us to say who we are without putting it in terms that are hostile to somebody else? So how do we get beyond? I think the things that we're doing are helping. I think you're going to sing in schools is helping, and the Inshallah choir is helping. These are sort of, if an event like tonight's is helping. These are sort of little gestures that help. And unfortunately, usually the people who are at these events are people who are already more inclined to be open, but maybe they then go influence other people, and there's some kind of ripple effect that takes place. That's my hope, anyway. I don't know how much evidence I can bring to bear for it.
Thank you. Well, it falls to me now on your behalf to thank our three speakers. We started our event together longing for a standing place, a meeting place of wisdoms in the text of this narrative, and I think we heard it. each one of the speakers took a very different approach. But if you listen, of course, the thread that all incline us toward is there. Let me give you my interpretation of the three threads that lead us to one. With Bob, rejection of rejection, God with the not chosen. With Imam Helel, submission of our will, our life to God, no matter what, in all circumstances. And with Brice, God's love is not binary. It is both and. Two stories, multiple histories. And we see where that leads us in all three to trust in the imagination of God. No matter how complicated and confusing the story, such as the Ishmael story is, all three wisdoms from our three speakers lead us to that place. Trust that the story that God is imagining in us and with us is going where it needs to go. Trust God. So I thank you for the wisdom, the inspiration, the good critical thinking, and that moment of aha for me where I see, okay, trust and leave the rest to God. So please join me in thanking our three speakers.
With that, sorry, I'm going to ask if we can all together take a selfie picture just to, celebrate that coming together. What do you think? Is everyone okay with it? Yeah. Okay. If you're not, let me know. I'll blur you out later. Let's see. I'm gonna have to.
Do you want us to get together?
I think if we get together, it would be nice. Yeah. Maybe. I'm gonna do that.